Okay, yeah, thank you, Wei. That was a great introduction. So let me get my notes here opened up. Okay, good. So yeah, so the talk today I'm giving is called Positive Obsession and Obsessive Positivity. So, you know, a provocative title. So I'm sure none of you have any idea what I'm talking about, but it sounds interesting. So that's probably what drew some of you here, and then hopefully I don't scare you away with a terrible talk. We'll see how it goes. But basically, just to give you some background, I became interested in this topic. So if I put the Chinese here, like vague in the background, it's like this emphasis on like this kind of obsessive, addictive compulsion for things that became something of an aesthetic value in the late Ming period in China, and then, you know, carried on into the Qing after that. So this always fascinated me, specifically from a philosophical perspective. So I do philosophical aesthetics. So I've always wanted to look at this period of time through a philosophical lens. So this is my attempt to start this endeavor. So this is very much a work in progress. I've tried my best in between classes to, you know, slip in some research here and there. So hopefully it won't come out as nonsense. Hopefully at the end of this we can, you know, get something interesting out of it. And if any of you have any questions that can help me further my research, so I can, you know, steal ideas from you, put it into my stuff, that would be great. So hopefully we'll have a nice Q&A period. So, and also I'll try my best to stay on time, because my students know I can tend to ramble on and go way over time, or I say I'm going to cut it short and then I don't. So let's see where this goes. So the first thing I'll do here is just give you a brief overview of the project I'm working on, specifically like the paper I hope to make this into. I'll just give you like an overview of the outline of it. So I was recently reading through some stuff and I encountered an article written by Octavia Butler, so the science fiction writer. So she has this article called Positive Obsession. It was originally called Birth of a Writer, because the magazine she published it in made her change the title. But she said she always wanted it to have been called Positive Obsession, so this idea stood out to her. And so she has this quote here that says, "Obsession can be a useful tool if it's positive." And so she goes on to talk about how her obsession with literature fueled the fire that got her career started. But at the same time, obsession was something like a double-edged sword that, you know, you throw your life and soul into something, and so it's like all or nothing. Like you either succeed or fail. It's like this kind of, like almost like this glorious battle with whatever thing that interests you. So what I'm interested in this project is trying to think about this idea of obsession in a positive light and try to make sense of what it might mean to be obsessed with something in a positive way. Because we tend to think about things like obsession, addiction, as just inherently negative concepts. And so specifically, I'm interested in thinking about this Chinese concept of P. So this is the main character. There's a bunch of similar terms that are connected to it. I'll get into them as we go. But this concept was clearly seen as a positive concept when at its height in the late Ming period. So I want to understand why that's the case, like what exactly is going on. Is there any merit to this as a philosophical concept? Is it just a bunch of nonsense going on, and then, like, you know, once the nonsense settled, we realized these people were insane and, you know, they should have been doing other things with their time? So I'll get into the background of why this concept grew in the way it did, and then get into some of the philosophers or thinkers who really kind of try to take it seriously at the height of its you know, influence. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'm going to look at how this concept gradually developed from initially a medical term for something that was not good, so I'll get into it in a little bit, into like an aesthetic virtue. And for some, it's the height of aesthetic virtue. So what is going on there? Why does this happen? And so specifically, I'm going to look at Ming and Qing sources. And so this concept really comes to its height in the late Ming period. It starts to dwindle in the Qing, but it still has this like resonance for Qing thinkers, precisely because they're influenced by some of the later Ming thinkers who really advocated for this. And I'm even going to talk about one scholar who I specialize in, who engages with this concept in like a comparative context when Western ideas were coming into China in the late Qing period. So I'm going to talk about how he takes this idea of P and some of these other concepts associated with similar ideas and brings them together with Western philosophers and Western thinkers and tries to basically reconcile this aspect of the Chinese tradition with this modern Western stuff that's coming in, you know, from the outside. So what I'm going to argue, like this is where I'm going to offer my own argument. This is the stuff that's still in progress, you know, the part where I have to make my own claim. So anything about this would be great. So I'm going to argue that what distinguishes a positive obsession. So the kind of obsession that these thinkers are advocating for is the object that it takes and the attitude that you take towards the object. So I'll get into a little bit what that means exactly, but these are going to be the 2 points that are of most significance. You have to be obsessed with the right kind of thing, and you have to take a certain kind of attitude towards your object of obsession. So you can't obsess over it in the wrong kind of way. And so after laying all this out, to basically try to show the contemporary relevance of this concept rather than treating it as a mere historical kind of artifact, I'm going to get into a modern example of what we might call a negative obsession, like a kind of obsession that goes off the rails according to this understanding of P. And what I'm going to look at is Byung-Chul Han. He calls it excessive positivity. And so I'll explain a little bit what that means. And so this is the origin of the weird title of my paper, this idea that positivity, as he understands it, becomes this kind of toxic aspect of modern culture. And we might be able to reorient the way that we think about it in different kinds of ways. So he suggests specifically the life of contemplation. So like getting away from just constant activity and trying to be more contemplative. So I'm going to suggest something that I just playfully call vita obsessa, so like the life of obsession or something like that. So I'll explain like this playful origin of this word, but I'm just basically taking the Chinese, translating it into the Latin that he likes to play with, and making sense of it there. So yeah, we can dive into this now. So I'll give you a brief history of this concept of P in the Chinese tradition and where it comes from, what it develops into, and why it develops in the way that it does. So P is originally a medical term. So it has a radical, like the radical is like the sickness radical, which tends to be associated with certain kinds of illness. And so it originally referred to indigestion from like, if you just eat too much food or drink too much, you just start to feel indigestion, you're bloated. And so that's what P originally referred to. It would even refer to like certain kinds of stones, like gallstones or something that develop when you overindulge. So they would talk about these stones as if they were a P that needs to be removed from your body. And so over time, this literal meaning becomes abstracted to mean something like overindulgence in general. So not just like literally eating too much food or drinking too much, but also just indulging in any kind of strange or eccentric activity in a way that sets you apart from society, like the norms of society. So I just put some examples of some terms in Chinese that make use of this idea. So the first one I love is just the weirdest term ever, and it just tends to stand for something like a person who has eccentric tastes. And so the word is just 是家之癖. And so it literally just means like an obsession with craving scabs. So it's like, somebody who like collects scabs on their body and like eats them or something, like weird stuff like that. So this is basically just the way that you would think about obsession at this early point. So it's clearly not a positive term. It's associated with perverted kinds of behavior and the kinds of things you wouldn't want people to engage in, especially in like a Confucian or Ruist context. We don't want people doing this kind of stuff. We want them to be engaging in things that are proper, like ritualistic behaviors. And so for Yuan Hongdao, he's a thinker that's going to become important after, like in this height of this Ming period. He's going to be one of the strongest advocates for this idea of P. He uses a similar phrase, so it's the same grammatical structure, he just replaces the object. So here we have 是处之癖. So instead of being obsessed with scabs, he's obsessed with like delight or interest. And so he'll give this argument where like, when it comes to literature, we shouldn't be thinking so much about the form that it takes, like the methods of expression or the kinds of feelings we're trying to express. These were the common arguments that were going around at the time. But instead, we should just be thinking about the delight we take in aesthetic experience. And so he's going to basically associate this aspect of delight with obsession. Like we should like indulge in the kind of aesthetic works that we engage with in an obsessive, almost like reverential way. Like they're almost like a religious object for us. So you can already see the transition happening. Similar grammatical phrase, completely different connotations. One's negative, one's positive. And so, as you can see, like it starts as a negative term, and it slowly over time starts to be perceived as a positive virtue. But, what's happening in between these gaps? So like, why does this end up happening? So, Judith Zeitlin is one of the scholars who has done the most research in English on this concept. So there's Chinese scholars doing a little bit, not as much as you'd expect. But she argues that during the height of this concept, like in the late Ming period, what it meant to have a P was to basically be like a free and unrestrained eccentric. So like they saw these people as genuine, authentic humans that weren't caught up in the social norms of society. So basically, she says it has overtones of hermeticism or nonconformity. So it's the kind of thing you would associate with a hermit or like a recluse who goes and lives in the mountains. But instead of like literally going to live in the mountains, it's like you're living in the mountains in your mind and the kind of objects that you choose to engage with and have a passion for. So you're basically just, you don't care about anything else. You just love this thing that nobody else cares about, not because it has utility or because it'll make you cool or something, but just because you want to indulge in this passionate mode of living. So this concept doesn't just immediately become this way, so it slowly starts to develop over time. So in the Tang Dynasty, you'll get scholars talking about it in terms of connoisseurship. So like the poet Zhījǐ talks a little bit about this idea like of thinking about people who like to collect fine works of art or, calligraphy or things like that. They would associate this with P, like this kind of like people who like to collect fine art are people who are obsessed with it. And so P starts to like slip into this more refined sense, like where the object of our obsession becomes more refined. And so the concept itself starts to be refined. Like it starts to be associated with what the upper class people would be doing rather than what the people who would originally be associated with it would be doing. And so over time, like during the Song Dynasty, it takes on an aesthetic dimension, but you start to get some scholars worrying about it. So like you'll get people like Su Shi, like this famous poet who sees the value in it, but also sees harm in this like mass consumerism. So they associate it with like overconsumption, and that we need to watch out. Like people who are too crazy in this regard are gonna like destroy society. So we need to find the proper balance. Like make sure that like books are the thing you're obsessed with, not like rocks or something, because then it's gonna start to become madness, like this kind of thing. So basically, these worries completely vanished by the late Ming. Like in the late Ming, you could just be obsessed with whatever you want. People who were obsessed with rocks and stuff were glorified, like they were seen as sagely kind of figures. So Yuan Hongdao gives this great like story of a person who loves flowers, and so he would like take a pillow and go lay in his garden and just lay by the flowers for days, like not moving until the flowers grew, flourished and then withered, and like only after the petals fell would he get up and leave, that kind of thing. So they would see this as like the ideal form of aesthetic appreciation, something to strive for, like similar to how a Confucian would strive to be a sage, that kind of thing. So the ideal in this aesthetic context is very strange. It's this ideal of just being obsessed with something to the point of like ruining your whole life, like in the sense of like your political life. And so we'll talk a little bit about why this is the case, like why this happens. But basically, what I want to point out here is just that this isn't the only concept that becomes valuable at the time. So this is basically just part of a trend that's developing. So I'm just associating it with P because this is a very significant concept, but a lot of other concepts that have a similar connotation start to flourish during this time. So a big one is Qing, like sentiment or emotion, that this is what it would have meant at this time. So like basically just thinking about like romantic, like these, these stories of romantic passion where lovers are, torn apart and because they're trying to maintain their love. So you get a lot of these kind of stories that are praised. You get similar concepts like madness, dementedness, derangement, addiction. These are all just like my translations of these terms. But all these words are associated with kinds of things that in a common context would not be taken as virtues. These things would be taken as, many of them would be taken as illnesses. So you can see like, we get the same radical. This is the sickness radical. You get the same thing on true, the sickness radical. So it's basically like a glorification of a kind of illness or sickness that's going on here that otherwise would not have been glorified. Okay, so one of the reasons why this concept develops the way it does has, less than philosophical origins. So I just frame it here in terms of like socio-political or economic developments. So basically, this concept starts to flourish among like people who are collecting things, people who are getting more money during this time, and then only when it's like at its height of popularity do philosophers come in and try to like make some sense of it. That tends to be how these things work. Like it becomes a social trend, and then the deep thinkers come in and try to like, draw lines between this is the good stuff, this is the bad stuff, this is what we should be doing, this is what we shouldn't be doing, that kind of thing. So during this period in the Ming Dynasty, there was more people in the population. I could put this here, I'll put all this up. So as the population was growing, there were more people who were able to receive an education, more people who were able to attempt to take the imperial examination and try to become members of the civil service. And so because there's more of them would fail and not become a part of it. So you had like a booming basically stratum of society. So the word here is like discarded scholars, like these 轶儒, like basically people who couldn't use their education to do the kind of thing you were supposed to do when you were educated, like become a scholar official and go like lead some local territory or something somewhere. So these people, because they couldn't succeed in society the way that they were, trained to do, but they had all this education, all this literary and aesthetic talent, they would just go out and sell their talent on the market, because at the same time as these people were becoming more educated, there was also a growing class of merchants who were starting to buy and sell things, and these merchants would have a larger influence on the trends in society than what they would have in the past. So in the past, these scholar officials, these 士大夫, would have the greatest influence on what matters most culturally speaking. So we're basically getting these merchants, these 商人, and then these literati, like these people who are literally trained in literary arts but don't have official positions, starting to influence social trends, like these cultural trends. And so you're getting this kind of battle in the market. And so these literati would take private work, selling their talents to the merchants, and so you would get this kind of stuff going back and forth in this booming economy that was happening at the time. And so one reason why this idea of obsession, like all of these, concepts associated with illness became so popular, was because it was a way for these disgruntled literati who couldn't succeed in society to basically distinguish themselves or justify, the fact that they didn't succeed. So they could say well, these are what really matter. This is what makes you authentic. That's why I wouldn't want to be a part of that anyway. It's like the sour grapes kind of thing. Those grapes are sour anyway. Who would want that stuff? So basically, these literati would try to distinguish themselves both from these scholar officials, but also from people who are just merely consuming on the market, just because stuff is nice and they want to make money. They would use these ideas to distinguish themselves, saying being eccentric, engaging in kinds of activities that aren't profitable, but also aren't maybe standard in the terms of following social norms. These are the kinds of things that make you authentic, because you're not trying to appease any class of people. You're only doing it for yourself. So, you can kind of see how these concepts start to be used as a tool to justify the status that these scholars would have had at this period in time. And so they start to basically associate themselves with, like I mentioned, recluses, these mountain people, these 山人, and they also start to highlight or associate with a kind of individuality, this 个人, as opposed to concerning themselves more with social trends or with the kind of Confucian values that involve intimate connections with other people and being 仁 and 义, having this humaneness and righteousness toward your family members and toward your government or things like that. So there's a strong sense of individualism and reclusivity going on at this point. So same thing, there's an emphasis on feeling strong emotions, as opposed to trying to restrain your emotions, which was a very common trend, not only in Confucianism, but also in Taoism, Buddhism. All of these philosophies try to talk about you should restrain yourself, traditionally. So we start to get scholars using these tools, from Taoism, from Buddhism, to advocate for strong emotional responses, or to advocate for kinds of illness. So a common way to talk about it is 无病之病, which would mean the illness that's not illness or something like that, or they would say 非病之病, an illness that isn't an illness. So this is how they would talk about the right kinds of illness, which are associated with these kind of obsessions with objects that set you apart from social trends or social norms. So these kind of illnesses can actually be used to cure the illnesses that otherwise would tear us apart, kinds of depression, or the sadness that comes with not being able to succeed as a scholar official. So this is how these concepts start to grow among this class of scholars at the time. And so same thing, there's an emphasis on amateur aspects in art rather than a kind of professionalism. So, we get this a lot in modern American society, for instance, you listen to grunge music or garage band music because it sounds more authentic because it's not so polished. So you get all this is happening all throughout history, even in the Ming Dynasty. They're praising people who aren't so polished because it can express a kind of authentic like immediate expression of your own kind of feelings and your own kind of desires. So all of this stuff is happening during the late Ming period. And so after all this happens, we start to get scholars who use these concepts or try to philosophize around them. And this is where the positions become a bit more subtle. And this is the stuff I want to focus on in the context of my paper, so that we can try to get a concept out of this that has merit philosophically, or if there is any merit, we can try to find it among what these scholars are saying. And so a big one is Zhījǐ. So I have a student who's focused on Zhījǐ, so he'll know what I'm talking about here. So Zhījǐ is something like a syncretist, like scholar in the late Ming period. He was basically a Confucian, like he worked as an official for a little bit, but then he decided to become a lay Buddhist later in life. So he's basically just dabbling in all these different philosophies. You read his works, he's throwing Taoist stuff in there, throwing Buddhist stuff in there, throwing Confucian stuff in there, but he's also doing a lot of like subverting expectations, like saying people who are bad are actually good and people who are good, like Confucius, are actually bad, and then just to try to like stir up the pot, so to speak. And so one of his most significant essays is on this idea of tongxin, like this childlike mind, or like a child's mind. And so this concept becomes extremely influential among later like scholars, both in like the philosophical context, but also in the context of like literary aesthetics. And so this idea of like basically becoming more childlike in your engagement with the world is going to be extremely influential on this analysis, or this like praise or celebration of obsession as an aesthetic value. And so one of his students, who is arguably the most influential in this context, is named Yuan Hongdao. And so he's basically just, he was like a younger peer of Zhījǐ. He was a friend of him, like studied under him a little bit. Not really like a student teacher, but they interacted with each other, and he was influenced by Zhīzī's ideas. And so he's going to offer the most like striking defense of obsession as a value. And so I'll just give you some quotes here that I thought were interesting, or some like passages. So he has this essay that he wrote called like A History of Vases, so 平视. So it's really just like a history of like flower arrangement in vases. So it's not just about literal vases, it's about like the art of flower arranging, and like talking about people who would obsessively collect certain kinds of flowers and try to arrange them in certain ways, and their whole house would be covered in these things, and they're all competing to do it in the right kind of way. So what he would say in this essay is that what separates P from other kinds of activity is that it involves no utility, and it's not engaged in the kind of commercial practices that would otherwise be prominent, among merchants, or the people who are trying to profit off of this, flower arranging culture. So he gives this quote here, like, if people really had obsessions, they would indulge them, devote themselves to them wholeheartedly, and plunge their whole lives into them. What time would they have for matters of money, officiating, or business? So we get this idea here that being able to engage with something obsessively as opposed to like superficially allows you to be more authentic, in the sense that it doesn't afford being corrupted by commercial practices or consumerist practices. Like, you want more money, you want to become an official and get power, or you want to like become a merchant and engage in these business practices. Instead, you're just wholly like cultivating your own sensibilities as an individual person, not caring about what the world thinks about you, that kind of thing. So this is going to be seen as like the height of aesthetic appreciation for these people, and also as the height of self-cultivation. So we get a sense in which this kind of like philosophical emphasis on self-cultivation is kind of blending into this concept of obsession. So he has another work here called like Mad Words. So again, we're getting this emphasis on like craziness that's being praised here. So there's a chapter, or like a short chapter in the text called like A Record of Obsession, or Obsessions. And so he basically just talks about what makes obsessive practices valuable, and it's very autobiographical, like he talks about his own experiences. And so this is where he offers this distinction between sentiment and method in literature. So this is what scholars would have been arguing about, like, when you read a book, should I judge it based on how like well it's structured, or based on how like strong the feelings I have when I read it are? So very common to like what happens in aesthetic debates all throughout history in all parts of the world. So he wants to say, no, none of those things really matter. What you need to do is like fuse them together, let them drop away, and then just allow a sense of delight or interest to pop up. Like, it shouldn't be about like judging it in accordance with this or that aspect. We should just engage with it delightfully And so the way he explains delight here is that, delight is something that arises when you have nothing that you depend on. So basically, you don't hold on to any sense that this or that is what matters. You're just like allowing yourself to kind of spontaneously react to what you're reading and allow whatever you encounter to kind of form some kind of delight in you, and you kind of indulge yourself wholeheartedly in whatever presents itself to you. So in this sense, you're not hoping to make money, you're not hoping to become powerful or popular, you're just allowing yourself to sink into the work that you're engaging with. So this is what he means by, there's nothing that you depend on. Like there's no kind of hope of making money or hope of being powerful or something like that makes the work valuable for you. So this last work here, so there's this great text called I just translated as A Brief History of Obsession and Derangement. So it's basically just a work giving you a bunch of anecdotes about people who had different kinds of addictions. So you'll get rock addictions, alcohol addictions. Somebody's addicted to the zhījǐ, this ancient text of Chinese philosophy. He's just addicted to studying it and writing commentary on it. So you get all these range of people who have all these different kinds of addictions. And all throughout this book, some of them are praised, some of them are condemned. And you can kind of see that certain kinds of objects are seen as better or worse when it comes to addiction. And so one of the big ones that they're going to praise is rocks. And a lot of it will be because the stability of a rock, literally metaphorically, will kind of represent a kind of stable, unchanging disposition. So in the same way that you aspire to obsessively long for something without being shaken by social norms or by a desire for power or money, the rock itself kind of represents that stability. So they would praise people who had obsessions for rocks. Also because rocks are pretty useless, they just kind of sit there, and they usually pick rocks that have weird shapes. So there's a great story by another scholar, who I'll mention now, in the early Qing period, late Ming period. His name's Pu Songling, so he's a short story writer. He has a great book of strange tales, tales about ghosts and weird stuff happening. And so he's basically, picking up these remnants of what was going on in the late Ming and incorporating it into his own kind of fascination with ghost stories and strange stories about weird people doing weird things. And so he has a story called the ethereal rock. I think I put it here. Yeah, so basically this guy finds a rock. The rock talks to him and says oh, my name's Mr. Rock. So the name of it literally is a rock that's clear and empty. But he literally says that that's his name. So it's written kind of like a name, Shi Qing Xu is his last name is Rock or something. So it's kind of this. He's engaging with the rock as if it's a friend. And so what happens is this rock just keeps getting stolen from him because everyone wants it so they can sell it or something. But the rock ends up just kind of slipping out of people's hands, going in a river, flowing down the river where the guy is standing on a bridge crying because he lost his rock. And he's oh, there's my rock. Just the rock keeps finding its way back to him. And then eventually the guy even dies, and then his ghost is going after the rock. And then eventually once the person is completely gone, the rock slips out of someone's hand and shatters. So you get this sense there's this intimate kind of relationship between the rock and the person. That obsession starts to be framed in terms of the way we would think about friendship or the way we would think about romance. So there's this sense in which being obsessed with something is almost like a kind of appreciation for it, so much so that the thing itself reflects that appreciation back at you. So we get this sense, I think I put it on a previous slide here. Yeah, so Li Zhījǐ talks a little bit about this in his own philosophy. He talks about this person who was obsessed with bamboo. And so he says, the person was obsessed with bamboo because he was depressed, because, he didn't have a good scholarly life. But, he basically started to form a friendship with this bamboo. And so the word he uses is zhījǐ. So this is a very significant concept in Chinese, this idea of a kind of that one person in your life that really gets you, that no matter nobody else understands you, but that person gets it. You'll get this a lot in Chinese culture where every person will have that one other person that really gets them. Zhuangzi has his friend Huizi. They both really get each other. Once Huizi dies, Zhuangzi's nobody gets me anymore, and they're all mopey. So you get a lot of stories like that. And so this is one of them. So in that case, the rock was his zhījǐ, and when he died, the rock died. They kind of died together. So we get this sense in which you can start to form these intimate kind of relationships, not only with other people, but with objects, as long as you respect them and treat them like a friend. And so this idea will become significant. And so the last person I want to mention here, jumping a little ahead. So as I mentioned, like during the Qing, this emphasis on peace starts to like, dwindle a little bit. Like once the fad is gone, people start to become a little more like strict with their Confucian values again. And so it's still lingering there among scholars, but they start to not be so crazy about it like Yuan Hongdao and Li Zhi were. So that trend starts to fall away. But I want to mention this scholar who I specialize in, who's like a late Qing, early Republican scholar. So he's living in that period when modern China, like, the dynastic China falls and the modern republic forms. And so right at the end of the Qing dynasty, he writes a bunch of essays basically engaging with Western philosophy because Western stuff is starting to pour into China at the time, due in large part to colonial practices. We've talked about this in my class. So what's happening is that Wang Guowei thinks that I can engage authentically with these sources. They're just like anything else. Like in the same way, Buddhism came into China and was able to be transformed by Chinese people into its own kind of indigenous way of thinking. These scholars in the modern period thought the same thing could be done with Western ideas. Like we can incorporate them, make use of them, and try to basically expand our own understanding of the world. And so one of the things Wang Guowei does is develop a view of addiction. So it's 嗜好. So this is another concept that's tied into this, idea of, thinking about these negative things that have negative connotations in a positive light. So 嗜好 would also be commonly seen as negative, like it's associated literally in modern Chinese, it's like with addictions to things like drugs. But it can also just be like an intense kind of craving for something. And so Wang Guowei is going to treat it as a value in that sense, that he's going to argue that everything is 嗜好, like even philosophy is 嗜好, like opium philosophy, it's all just different kinds of addictions. So what we need to do is not get away from addiction, but try to find the right thing to be addicted to, because all we have in this life is just these kind of ephemeral things that we can like latch onto to give our life meaning. So he's very existentialist, nihilist in that way. There's no kind of ultimate purpose to things. He's reading a lot of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, so you can see like where that influence comes in. Like he's starting to think like, he's taking this God is dead idea and kind of putting it in a Chinese context. So he's saying, okay, God is dead, then all we have are like the kind of things in life that we can be passionate about until we die, that kind of thing. So that's what he's talking about here. So what he's going to do is incorporate Western thinkers into this discussion. So he's not doing it explicitly, but this is something I'm arguing that, he's taking a lot of these terms that would have had, significant meaning in the Chinese context by this point. So, Li Zhi, all these scholars in the Ming would have influenced the tradition to such an extent that you couldn't think about 嗜好 or Pi without thinking about what they were doing in that context. So what he's going to do is take those discussions and fold them into what Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Friedrich Schiller, Immanuel Kant, what these figures are doing in the context of Western philosophy. So you may not know these figures, no worries, I'm not going to get too deep into what these figures are talking about. But one thing he'll do is he'll take Nietzsche's language and Schopenhauer's language of the will, and he'll try to fold it into this discussion. So Schopenhauer has this idea that we're all driven by a will to life, which is basically we're all just struggling to survive basically, and that's what drives us, so life sucks, we should just give up on life. Schopenhauer's very pessimistic in that sense. But Nietzsche's more optimistic. He thinks, no, what's really driving us is this will to power, and what we should do is try to empower ourselves, embolden ourselves by the fact that God is dead, there's no external source of meaning anymore, by making life meaningful for ourselves, imposing our own meaning on it, because this gives us a chance to become gods ourselves, that kind of thing. So Wang Guowei will play with both of these ideas. He's not going to be as extreme as either of these people. He's going to think, yeah, there's a sense in which, engaging in these activities of power, these where our surplus energy can be aimed towards some kind of passion project is valuable, but at the same time, depression's always going to slip in. You can't avoid it. You can't become an Ubermensch or an overhuman in Nietzsche's context. So what he's going to do, like I said, he's going to just say that everything from opium to philosophy is addictions, mainly because opium was a huge problem at this point in China. Everyone was addicted to opium. Chinese society was falling apart, and all the scholars were trying to figure out how do we fix this problem. So he was trying to argue that you can't just take away the opium. You got to kind of give people a sense of meaning and value in their life. And the way we do that is by kind of teaching them how to find things that can give them meaning and value, or giving them the chance to do that rather than just saying opium is now illegal, because then people will just find ways to get it illegally or something like that. So very interesting take. So what he'll do is he'll say, everything's addictions, but some addictions are better than others. So he uses the words noble and base here. So he's taking this from the Chinese tradition, but probably also from Schiller and Nietzsche, who like to talk in terms of nobility with respect to will to power. And so he's going to say what base addictions do, and these are addictions like drugs, gambling, alcohol, things like that. Like when we become overly addicted to these things, they basically just shut off our mind so that we're all agitated, like we feel unsatisfied with life. And there's two ways to solve that problem. We can either find some kind of momentary satisfaction, and so the satisfaction we feel can be more or less powerful depending on how meaningful the thing is that is satisfying us. So we create a great work of art that can be very meaningful, but we just we win at a video game or something that can be meaningful for like a day or two, and then it starts to wear off, we have to find something else. But what these base addictions do is just turn off that sense of agitation. So instead of satisfying ourselves, we just turn off the need for satisfaction. So he's going to say those kind of things are not what we should be doing because it's just prolonging the inevitable. We're basically dead as long as we're on the addiction, and once it's gone, nothing is satisfied, everything's worse. So we should try to help people find ways to find noble addictions. And so one thing to note here is that he'll use the word P, but he'll specifically reserve it for the base addictions. So he's just using the word in the way that we would commonly use it. But he still treats this idea of shihao, this idea of having an addiction, as a neutral term. You can find an addiction that's base or like a P, but you can also find addictions that are valuable, like art, philosophy, science. These will be the kinds of things that he'll think are the most valuable. Okay, good. Yeah, so he's going to argue that art is the best one because it allows us to express meaning, make meaning, and it's also accessible. It's easier to engage in artistic practices than it is to go and get a degree in philosophy or learn physics or something. So he's going to think art is something we can start with. Everyone can get access to art. Anybody, anyone can manifest an amateur ideal in art and still get some meaning out of it. So we should be cultivating a kind of aesthetic education in society, which he has no influence on society. That's not what happens. So he failed in that regard, but his ideas are still interesting nonetheless. So I'll briefly here talk about the objects and attitudes. So the main points I want to make are first that in the context of the Ming Dynasty, when it comes to obsession, you can't direct your obsession towards other people. So this is like Zeitlin says here that obsession tends to be focused on a fixation on some kind of object or maybe an activity, like some kind of practice, but it's never focused towards a person. So you'll get Qing aimed towards a person, like the idea of feeling, but obsession will be kind of the similar activity but aimed towards an object. And so the question is, why is this the case? Why can't I have a positive obsession of another person? So we might already have a sense of why that's the case. People who are obsessed with other people tend to not be the kinds of people we want to associate with. But the idea here is that for Li Zhi, obsession is a kind of friendship. So we talked about this, you become friends with the bamboo. But for Yuan Hongdao, he elaborates on this, and he talks about how obsession is the self loving the self. So when I'm obsessed with something, it's not because I actually love that thing in the way that I love another person. It's because I'm trying to manifest my own self and try to become more authentic and cultivate myself. So in order for both of these things to be true, I argue, you can't actually think that a rock is another person that's your friend, in the same way that another person is another person, and you can't obsess over another person because if it's the self loving the self, but there's actually another person there, it's not going to go well. That person's going to reject your advances, so to speak, whereas a rock will not because it's a rock. So the idea here is that it's an imagined kind of relationship that you're having, that you're cultivating yourself by showing some kind of deep respect or reverence or care for some aspect of the world that doesn't have its own ability to care back at you. So there's no harm in subverting the agency of the object of obsession. So the other aspect will be you can't be obsessed with base addictions. And so Yuan Hongdao talks about this in terms of consumerist aspects, money, business, whatever. Wang Guowei talks about this in terms of opium, alcohol. And as I mentioned, these dull the mind, or they tend to promote conflict with other people. And as we mentioned, when other people start to get involved in our addictions, things don't go well. So the idea is that neither of these are conducive to a kind of friendship relationship that's necessary. You turn off your brain with drugs, you can't really start to form these kind of genuine, authentic bonds with the world and understand it with reverence. You're just turning your mind off. And if you are thinking in terms of profit, like if capital is what you're obsessed with, then that's just going to start to produce conflict with other people. Given the nature of the object of your obsession, you won't be able to like form a friendship-like relationship with it. It's going to naturally become toxic. So that's part of what I argue, that what it means to have P in the context is to have this kind of imagined friendship relationship with objects of your passion. Okay, good. So I'll briefly go over like the last point. This is the point that needs the most work, but for the sake of time, how much time do I have left? Like 5 minutes or so?
It took 2 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay, then I don't have to go. I thought it said 5 when I looked over it. Oh, okay, good. Okay, good. Good. I don't have to rush as fast as I thought. Okay, good. So this is where I'm going to introduce this kind of, punny contradiction that I made in the title, talking a little bit about what Byung-Chul Han calls excessive positivity. So I'll explain this a little bit here. So as I said, obsession, or P in this context, when it's seen as a value, is seen as a kind of like imagined friendship with objects. So you're basically treating this object with reverence and respect in the way that you would treat a friend. So you're basically treating the object as an extension of yourself, and in that sense, you don't want to hurt yourself, so you try to treat it in the way that you would want to be treated. Like the golden rule is at play here, because you're trying to be authentic. You're not trying to like use it or make use of it in any kind of way. Okay. So a negative obsession, by contrast, would just be obsessions that take the wrong kind of object or adopt the wrong kind of attitude. So if you obsess over drugs or something, or you obsess over capital or profit, that object is going to not lend to the right kind of relationship. Or if you adopt a different kind of attitude, like you're not trying to be a friend, you're trying to obsess over things in order to make money or power or something, then inevitably it's going to just collapse. So both of these aspects in this context will result in a kind of the obsession, the imagined friendship falling apart, and on their view will lead to just kind of catastrophe, in the sense of like your own sense of self-cultivation will be all distorted, and you won't become content in your own life, you won't be authentic, et cetera, those kind of things. And so a modern example I want to give of something that we might think of as a negative obsession on this view is this idea of excessive positivity. And so I pick it because Byung-Chul Han's pretty popular as a philosopher. He has a lot of influence and his stuff is interesting, but also it's very modern in the sense that he's concerned with like what our contemporary technological society, our digital society does to us. So he basically thinks that we're always just kind of in a mode of activity, like we're always on social media scrolling, we're always trying to like do better at our job, get more and more money, do more and more, like produce more and more papers in the context of academia. And this kind of thing just leads to burnout. Like we're just constantly striving to produce more and more and more and be more productive. And so society's telling us like, you can do better, you can do great. So there's no more like, he thinks there's no more like discipline in the sense that like, you're saying you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. It's more like, you're able to do this, you're able to do that. And we feel the pressure to succeed on this sense. So whether or not disciplinary society is gone, I think is a question. I think some of his ideas are a bit oversimplified, but interesting nonetheless. So I thought it would be worth talking about. So, this is this idea here that what it means to be like have excessive positivity is to be like constantly driven to maximize production or achievement. So this is why he calls it positivity, that it's not about like not doing things, it's about like feeling like we can do anything. And so then feeling pressured to like do more and more and more. Like, like my colleague did this, so like I should be able to do that. Or like my cousin was doing that, and your parents start to tell you like, how come you can't be as successful as your cousin or something? These kind of situations where we constantly feel pressure to be more than what we currently are. And so this is what just like kind of slowly wears us down. So here he talks about like, the violence of positivity isn't something that deprives us of anything. It like oversaturates us. And so same thing, it doesn't exclude anything, but like exhausts us with too much information. We're scrolling through the internet to the point where like our eyes are bleeding and we just feel dead inside because there's just infinite content to look at and we can never stop. So what he'll argue is that, in opposition to a philosopher named Hannah Arendt, I won't get into the details here, who praises the active life, like trying to think about engaging in a certain kind of activity, Han will want to argue that we should try to focus on renewing what he calls the contemplative life, like a life where we kind of sit, rest, relax, reflect on things, focus on contemplating what's going on rather than constantly trying to do more and more and more and more and more, and not just reflecting in order to like recharge our batteries, like, like the way we plug in our phone. That tends to be what we think of, like, go home and watch Netflix, binge watch a show, just to like recharge so that we can go back to work. That kind of sense of leisure as useful in the sense that it makes us more productive. But thinking about leisure as having inherent value, like that's what life is really about. That's what it means to be human, not the kind of constant striving. So here's one of the examples he gives, like, the loss of the ability to contemplate, which among other things leads to like the absolutization of this active life, is also responsible for the hysteria and nervousness or hyperactivity of modern society. So that's his worldview. So his whole shtick is like, go back to contemplating more, like, we need to bring back ritualistic practices, be more religious in the way that we think about the world around us, like, have a reverence for the objects that we engage with or with the world, not like a sense of constantly seeing everything for how useful it can be. So here are some aspects I'll give. I'll just kind of briefly go through this. That should be good. So for him, contemplation is something that entails inactivity, uselessness, and selflessness. So the idea is like, not inactivity in the sense that you're literally not doing anything, but that you're not doing anything with any purpose in mind. So, artistic practice in the sense where you're just painting something because it's interesting to you and you just want to see where this goes, not because you want to sell it and then, make some money off of it, that kind of thing. This would be what he thinks of as inactivity. So we're not thinking of ourselves as functioning in order to like produce something, and that like I could be a better person because I'm not fulfilling my function well. So that tends to be like, what modern society makes us think about ourselves. And in this sense, it's like we're just constantly struggling to survive, not only literally, but also like to survive on the job market or something like that. So this is the kind of activity that like dehumanizes us on his view. And so he's going to say that when we engage in this kind of inactivity, we basically lose our sense of self. We become a no one. We kind of merge with the world around us and we forget ourselves. And so he's also going to associate it with like festivity, passivity, and friendliness. So we can start to see like this idea of friendship is coming into play. So there's some resonance here. So he'll say stuff like, when we're engaging in a celebration, time stands still. Like we're not looking at our watch to say like, okay, like, like I am right now, how much time do I have left in this presentation? So, that kind of thing. So we're not doing that. So we're just kind of enjoying what's happening at the moment, living outside of time, so to speak, like in our conception of the world around us. Same thing, so he associates this with what he calls like a childlike passivity, just allowing things to hit us and come in so that we're like listening carefully to the world around us, not trying to produce things or change them for some kind of purpose. And then we don't see rigid boundaries between things. So he says like, things open themselves up to each other, and we could say they become, friendly toward each other. So we can already see some resonances here. And so what he wants to argue is that, human existence is a composite of these two aspects. Like, yeah, we got to engage in activity. We can't just like be motionless forever. We'll just starve to death, that kind of thing. But we need balance. We need to treat both of these things as valuable in and of themselves, not one as a means to achieving the other. So this is where we get, I just put the Chinese translations of these terms I just used the ones of Hannah Arendt's use of these terms. So these are like the Chinese. So I thought it would be fun to just kind of like take the idea of Pishu and like try to translate it back over and see if this idea can fit into this discussion. So Western scholars in particular like to like make this distinction between action and contemplation. So I just thought it would be interesting, like maybe this is like a false dilemma and we can add like other aspects to this. Like how might obsession fit into this as like a trinity, so to speak? So this is just something I'm playing with in the paper. So here's what I came up with so far. So this is the part that needs the most work, so any suggestions would be great. So I want to say that, obsession is also inactive and useless in the sense that you're not trying to achieve anything, you're not engaging with things for the sake of utility. It's inspired by these Taoist ideas of like not acting with intentional or deliberate intentions, or, treating things as useless rather than useful. And it also requires you to be reclusive and eccentric, so there's no sense of utility. So the other aspect, it's also festive and friendly. We talked about it involves a kind of indulgence into the object, almost like it's a reverential object, to the point where like you're not concerned with the passage of time. That person will sit with a pillow by a flower for days until he's finally done exhausting with it. No concern for like missing work or anything like that, these practical concerns. Most of us cannot do that in this case. And same thing, like friendship is important in this context. So the differences I wanted to point out here are the fact that it's not selfless and it's not passive either, at least as I understand it. So yes, the child's mind is at play here, but what it amounts to is the self loving the self we talked about. So there's this sense in which the self is preserved here in a fundamental way where it's not in the case of contemplation, where contemplation is more about like becoming detached, letting yourself fall away. You know, the common example is like you're overwhelmed by nature and you start to feel small, and that makes you feel insignificant, and you start to become folded into things. This is much like almost the opposite. Like you're engaging with something that's relatively small, like a rock, and you're obsessively loving it to the point where like your sense of self, your passions kind of engulf everything. So there's a significant difference. And then the other one here is that there's a kind of imagined projection going on. That you're not just being passive, you're engaging with this thing, attributing properties to it, making it into a kind of person you can become a friend with based on, you know, extending yourself onto that thing. So what do we make of this? So this is where I'll end here, I guess, in terms of time. So I'll put this slide up here. So what I want to say here is that I think we can think of contemplation and obsession as like two sides of the same coin, conceptually speaking, and both of them involve a non-distinction between self and world. And so, you know, when we're engaging in activity, like the kind of thing that he associates with Hannah Arendt, we become distinct. Like, I'm me, this is the thing I'm engaging with, I need to do this in order to achieve that, you know, that kind of thing. So Arendt says something like, we become a somebody when we engage in activity, and this is when our personhood manifests, like in the political sphere specifically. And so for him, when we engage in contemplation, we lose ourselves. Like we dissolve into nature as a whole, or into the beautiful sky that we're looking at, or into like the sunset on the ocean. We kind of dissolve into it and have an appreciation for nature. So what I'm going to argue is what happens when we're obsessed with something is the opposite, that the world dissolves into us, like into our own sense of self. And I think there's a sense in which, like, when we think about what children do, we can think of it in both these ways. So yeah, you can think about children as selfless, which a lot of these philosophers tend to do, but I think we could also think about children as kind of selfish in the sense that like they want to play with this thing, like they're so immersed in the activity, but what they care about is like their own kind of joy and activity in the moment. They're not making conceptual distinctions, but at the same time, they're not like a Buddha. Like, you know, like as an adult, we might get annoyed that they're like, no, that's my toy. Like, you know, you try to take it from them and they're vicious about keeping it, you know, that kind of thing. So I think something like that is going on here. So, you know, I just had this quote from Yuan Hongdao about, you know, it's really about loving me, not about loving the thing itself. And so the last point I'll end on is that there's something in Wang Guowei that's very similar to this. So he talks about these two worlds in the context of poetry. So he talks about like the world of self-absence, so this is 无我之境, and so he talks about the world of self-presence, 有我之境, and so he calls the first one beautiful and the second one sublime, so he's using like these Western concepts. And so basically the idea is like, when we're in a state where the self is absent, our sense of self becomes clear, like we reflect the world around us, like so we're empty of our own kind of intentions. But when we're in this world of self-presence, which is where like feeling and emotion and passion can become manifest, like these aspects that are significant to what makes us human, then the world itself becomes colorful. Like specifically, it takes on our own color, like as the kind of person that we are. And so there's this sense in which both these kinds of activities may have value. And so it might be worth thinking about like, you know, not merely just emptying our sense of self in a Buddhistic way, but also kind of passionately and authentically kind of giving expression to ourself as well. And specifically through like a reverential engagement with things that matter to us most about the world. Like, you know, this rock is not just a rock. This is like my whole being. This means something to me. And I think we all kind of have a sense of that. Like when we find something that means something to us in the world and we attach to it, we start to feel, you know, we feel like life has meaning and purpose, and that can drive us to keep going. So I think that's what's going on here a little bit. Okay, so I'll end here. I have my references if anyone's interested in reading any of these books. But yeah, thank you, and if there's any questions.